Hello everyone and welcome. You're here with Kelly of the Forgotten South, and today we are at Stagville. This is what was the center of a very large plantation operation just outside of Durham, North Carolina. It was started sometime between 1788 and 1790. Richard Benahan built a 24 by 16 foot house, which is actually what this one is right here. Of course, it was expanded later. Benahan was a trader. He worked in a store, and this property actually was along an important native trading route. So he thought it'd be a great place for a property and to expand his empire as a store owner. So like I said, this was the first cabin built, this one right here. At the time that he built this, he also built a kitchen, a smokehouse, a milk house, and several cabins for enslaved people here. A blacksmith shop was also added in the late 1790s. And by 1799, the original house was expanded with a larger addition, which is what we see here, of course. By the time that this addition was made, Benahan had 3,914 acres. He had multiple barns, granaries, cribs, and stables here on the property. He also enslaved 42 people back then in 1799. In 1803, Richard's daughter Rebecca married Duncan Cameron, who was also a neighboring prominent property owner and farmer here. They kind of made a contract between their families to consolidate their neighboring properties, and then it essentially became a vast 6,000 acre tract that was all overseen here from Stagville at that point. So now I'm going to show you some of the other stuff that's still remaining here at Stagville. There are a few interesting structures and some stories that I've heard about this place, so I kind of want to go through those with you. We're going to walk around to the back of the house. Where we're going to see where what would have been the summer or the kitchen garden. This is where enslaved people would have gardened for the family to feed them inside the big house. So this is a replica of what that garden might have looked like, the things that they might have grown. I'm going to try to avoid a sprinkler. They definitely didn't have sprinklers back then. Okay. So the summer garden right there, back of the house. Now, interestingly enough, the kitchen doesn't still stand, but the ruins of it does. So these stones right here is where the kitchen is believed to have stood, right behind the house in the traditional style, so that it would have been close by enough to get the food to the home quickly, but also so that it would avoid fires. They'd also keep the kitchens further back, not only for fires, but because, of course, cooking inside would heat up a building pretty quickly, which would be pretty not appealing in North Carolina in the summers here, where it gets very hot. Also, the smells from cooking would sometimes bring pests, so you'd rather have them not in your main house, if possible. So that's where the kitchen was. And I believe the kitchen burned down in the 1880s. I'm not positive on that, though. I'll have to look for y'all. So back here, we're going to walk over to this property where we're going to move into a beautiful little wooded patch. But what happened back here is where this is where the houses for enslaved persons stood. So these would have been a specific type of a person who worked a specific type of job for the plantation owners. These would have been the domesticated enslaved or enslaved persons who would have been like seamstresses, waitresses, cooks, nannies, and that kind of thing. So not the people that worked in the field. They had equally hard lives. As you can see, I'm just walking over to where they lived right now. So imagine if you lived this close to the plantation owner, they could call on you at any time of the day or night. So this that we see right here outlined in stone, if you can kind of make out this outline here, this is the footprint of one of the slave homes that was here. A few things have been recovered archaeologically from this site that kind of give us a little bit more insight into them, into the people that lived here and what their lives might have been like. There was something that's called a cowrie shell that in my mind looks as close to something I would think of like a conch shell. But these were things that, that were traditionally collected by the ancestors of people that were enslaved here. So it's interesting to think that maybe that shell might have come from Africa or the West Indies. Here's a picture of it. They also found a lot of pieces of broken pottery that seemed to be that when the nice fine china or pottery from the big house was no longer useful to them, they would give it to the enslaved people here to use. So some of that was found in scraps around that home. So if you can see, here's where the house was. And then right there, right through the trees, was the Benahan house. So they really didn't get much of a break from that life. Whereas it's thought that the enslaved persons who were forced to work on the farm would have had at least a little break when the sun went down. Here's one of the barns on property. I just love this old chinking here. Probably important that I watch where I walk, right? Again, this property is surrounded by beautifully maintained woods that you can hike some of the trails. So if you ever get the chance to come out here, I totally recommend that you do. So after Richard Benahan passed away in 1825, Stagville would pass through his descendants. They lived here into the early 1900s, but by 1925, Stagville had kind of fallen into disrepair. Richard had 2 children. His daughter, Rebecca, who married Cameron, she would move away, of course. And then his son would never marry and never have any heirs. So by 1950, the property had been sold to a timber property who cleared all the land of all of its trees. And once they had done that, they sold it to a tobacco company who then donated it to the state of North Carolina. In 1976, I believe, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Now we have one more thing to see here while we're at Stagville, and that is the family cemetery. Something about a family cemetery on an old plantation is just very intriguing to me. And I wanted to show you guys this one because it's interesting. So we're going to walk out in the yard here, or out into the woods. It's about 100 yards or so from the house. Okay, so in this cemetery, it's interesting. It's a large space that was kind of set aside, but there's only 3 burials in here. So there's a couple of reasons or speculation about why that might be. I'll get up a little bit closer and show you guys what I'm talking about. So if you can see, we're out here in these beautiful woods. Walking on property that people have lived in for a very long time. So we're surrounded here by stone that was all quarried on Stagville site. This great wall that surrounds the entire place. And it's got this original iron gate on it, which I just love the iron that you find in cemeteries. The ironwork is always so intricate and interesting. And to think about how heavy these are and where it would have had to have been made to make it out here by the time that they were burying people here is just a feat that we probably can't quite understand in the days of Amazon Prime, right? Okay. So there's only 3 interments here. I'm going to do a pan so you guys can see. This great area was set aside specifically for this family's burials, but as I mentioned, Benahan's daughter moved away, and his son never married and never had any heirs. So the only 3 people here that are buried here are Benahan, Richard Benahan, his wife Mary, and their son. The first burial was Richard's wife Mary Amos Benahan. She was born in 1756 and died in 1812 at age 55 or 56. She married Richard in 1776. You can kind of make out some of the inscription here. So she was the first one to be buried here in 1812. The next grave is of Richard Benahan, who was the trader and plantation owner and slave owner who ran this property. Richard was born in 1743, and he died in 1825 when he was 82. And then finally, the last interment was of their son, who's Thomas Dudley Benahan. He was born in 1782 and died in 1847. So he was 64, and like I mentioned, he never married or had any children. So the Benahan line kind of ended there with him. The cemetery is very peaceful, but kind of eerie that there's no one else here. It's suspected that Richard thought that many generations of his descendants would be buried here, but of course the story went a different way, and that's not what happened. So it's just the 3 of them that are buried here, and I imagine it will only ever be the 3 of them that are buried here. On this large, expansive plantation, at the time of emancipation, there were 900 people enslaved between the Benahan and Cameron plantations here that was based out of Stagville. There still is not a designated marker anywhere that shows us where the enslaved people might have been buried. Back then, they weren't afforded the dignity of headstones or markers in most cases. So we definitely wouldn't be looking for that, but there is amazing technology with ground penetrating radar that can help to find unmarked graves. And I'm hoping that someday that technology will be able to come out here to Stagville so that we can identify where those souls are laid to rest. It's a really peaceful property, and I'm so grateful to be here. But it's always a little bit heavy too when you spend a nice day hiking a property that, in the back of my mind, I know that most of the people that lived here never got to take a leisurely stroll through the woods, enjoying the scenery. So today I'd like to be grateful for that. If you have any questions about the Stagville property, please feel free to message me or comment down below. I'd be happy to answer anything else that I can. And if you get the chance, if you're ever in the Raleigh or Durham area, I highly recommend that you come out here to Stagville and see this property as well as Horton Grove and the Great Barn. I've made a video on Horton Grove and the Great Barn as well, so make sure to check those out. Thank y'all for being here.